Hey, all right, world history students. Here is our lecture on the Punic Wars for our Roman unit. Um, and you're going to have your outline and be ready to follow on our three main points and conclusion. But we'll be talking about this as a transformative moment for the Roman Republic around the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. All right, here we go. So our first point is just some outlining of the rivalry between Rome and Carthage. In our last lecture on the Roman army, we talked about how Rome and its successful military with border disputes and with other Italian tribes led it to be dominant along the entire boot of Italy, the Italian peninsula. But then that consolidation of power just simply led it into competition with a neighboring empire that was older and already more established, and that was the Carthaginian Empire. And they began to have a rivalry over the Mediterranean Sea and the trade routes and the sea lanes in which they were competing for commerce. They were trading for partners in terms of who was going to be the number one trading partner with either empire, and then of course just a general competition over resources, silver mines in Italy, or salt trade down in North Africa, or various other resources. So again, when they're just within Italy, Carthage wasn't such a big deal. Carthage didn't have an issue with Rome, but as they expanded, now all of a sudden they're coming head to head over these three issues around the Mediterranean Sea. The Carthage, or where we get the name the Punic Wars, is that's just a derivative of the word Phoenician. And the Phoenicians were kind of the ethnic group that made up the Carthaginians. So if you ever heard of the Phoenicians, they were a sea power of traders throughout the Mediterranean Sea. They're also the same group of people known as the Philistines in the Old Testament. So when we talk about Philistines in the Middle East, they're on the coast. Those were actually the Phoenicians or the sea traders who were also, established their capital in North Africa, the city of Carthage. And again, they were traders, and they basically were known for their powerful navy, because again they were a sea state. Whereas as far as land forces, their army was usually hired. They were very wealthy merchants, wealthy at trade, very powerful. But then their army was usually something they hired. They usually hired mercenaries if they needed protection from a land army. So then that takes us into the conflict. So what did the Punic Wars look like? The first thing to note is that there are three stages or three Punic Wars. So that's why they're called the Punic Wars. Um, and so we'll go over the basics of each conflict in the second point. So the first conflict comes in about the mid 250s BC, and they're primarily fighting over Sicily. Now, Sicily is that small island, or whatever you want to call it, rock getting kicked by the boot of Italy. And so that makes sense. That was the first territory that was really closest to Rome, but also had traditionally been a sphere of influence for Carthage, which is there on the tip of what is modern day Tunisia in North Africa. And so they're kind of a battle over border security. It being an island territory, the Carthage initially has the advantage because they have a navy. The Romans, they're warriors on land. They've never really gone beyond their sea borders, and so they don't have much of a navy. They don't have a lot of experience. Again, they're more of a land force. However, over time, the Romans learn, and we talked about their adaptability last lecture, but they learn how to build a navy. They learn how to engage in naval combat, and through several years of bloody conflict, in which thousands perish on both sides, they're able to defeat the Carthaginian forces around Sicily and take control of that island, along with the two purple islands just to the west of Italy, Corsica and Sardinia. And so basically, after the First Punic War, Rome gains control of the three islands there off the coast of Italy, and it forces that Carthage to pay it tribute. So Rome comes out on top, and again gains a little more of a sphere of influence right in its immediate area around the Mediterranean. This is just an example of the Roman adaptation. One of the innovations of the Romans, in fact, with was not having a navy. They would literally take any destroyed or discarded Phoenician slash Carthaginian ships, and they would rebuild them. And they would look at how they were structured so that they could learn to build their own. And then they even improve them by building. This is just an example of a boarding bridge that they would use to utilize their greatest strength, which was their soldiers, Again, they're professional soldiers versus the hired mercenaries of the Carthaginians, where they could again bring the ship into contact, but then turn it in effectively kind of into a land battle by allowing their troops, like almost like pirates, to board the opposing vessel. So just an example of where again Rome entered the battle, the First Punic War, without at a disadvantage and without the necessary experience, but they learned and they adapted and they stole and adopted new ideas and came out victorious in the longer run. The second stage, or what's often called the Second Punic War, is the most wide scale. So it's kind of the most widespread and intense and of the three conflicts. You'll see why that doesn't apply to the third one, and when we get there. And in this case, you can see the three islands had become territory of Rome, but now they're fighting over Spain. Rome had Carthage had begun to expand into Spain following their loss in the First Punic War. However, Rome, via land routes, began to also vie for influence there as well, particularly over silver mines, among other resources. And so as they began to get into conflict, Carthage decides they're going to invade Rome directly, and they're going to do it over a land route. So they send their forces from Spain through what would be modern day France and over the Alp Mountains. You can see those notated on the map, and down into the Italian peninsula. The Carthaginians were led by a very famous ancient general known as Hannibal, who's renowned for his skills as a tactician and being able to carry out this intense invasion over a long distance. And the invasion goes really well. In fact, the most notorious battles in Italy is a Roman defeat at Cannae, in which Hannibal is able to surround an entire army of Rome and kill up to 60,000 men, and along with their two consuls. So we talked about there being two consuls. After the Battle of Cannae, Rome has lost an entire army, legion of soldiers, and its two leaders are dead. So it was a devastating defeat for Rome, and also with the loss of their army, Hannibal was able to march up and down the Italian peninsula, ravaging the countryside with no real significant force to stop him. So Rome was really knocked back on its heels by the surprise invasion and then the tactical prowess of Hannibal and the Carthaginians marching into Rome during the Second Punic War. Uh, the one thing that Hannibal was not able to do as he ravaged Rome was that he was not able to actually conquer Rome itself or any of the major cities. While there was no army to oppose him in the countryside, he wasn't able to. He'd lost siege towers, basically the equipment he needed to take down walled cities while crossing the Alps, which are this mountain range at the north of Italy. And so he couldn't conquer the city. So he's kind of like he's locked out. He's in total control of the neighborhood. He's in total control of the streets, but he can't get into the quote unquote houses or the main city centers of Rome. And so Rome, rather than try to raise an army and defeat him, let me move my picture here so you can see the map. Rather than try to face him in Italy, they decide to divert him and raise an army in Sicily and invade Carthage's capital there in North Africa, outside Carthage itself. And so now another similarly famous Roman general, Scipio Africanus, he's going to be given that name after success in this battle, is he lures Hannibal out of Italy by attacking Carthage and the capital. And so Hannibal and Scipio meet at the Battle of Zama, just outside the city of Carthage, in which Hannibal is defeated. And so Carthage, although they have the initial advantage, they end up losing even the Second Punic War after the defeat at Zama. And they surrender their entire empire at this point. It's not just a couple islands in the Mediterranean. They surrender their claims to all territory outside the immediate vicinity of Carthage. So it is a major blow to the Carthaginians and a major military victory for the Romans. Just some renditions of statue of Hannibal, the great invader of Rome and Italy. Absolutely famous for his march of African elephants, armed African elephants, through France, up from Spain, through France, and over the snowy Alps north on the north end of Italy, conjuring up amazing images of what that must have looked like. And again, you imagine that those elephants brought in to invade Rome proper, where a majority of the people had never even seen an elephant. So imagine a creature of that size invading your homeland, and you never even seen one before. It was a momentous feat and incredibly successful until he ends up being diverted away back to engage Scipio in North Africa. Uh, Another picture, again, this is the Battle of Cannae, the initial catastrophic defeat of the Roman legions and the loss of the two consuls. If you know the fan of the Lord of the Rings and you've seen the Return of the King, the Oliphants in that are definitely built, extrapolations of the images of Hannibal's march up and down Rome with his elephant soldiers. And that brings us then to the Third Punic War, which happens about a generation later, and about 100 years since the overall conflict with the Carthaginians emerged. And this isn't really much of a war, but a one-sided annihilation. Again, in the Second Punic War, Carthage had been stripped of its empire. They had only their most immediate territory left. They were forced to pay tribute and kind of reparations to the Roman people that was bankrupting the city, and they began to um, they began to resent that, but also Rome continued to resent them. And again, this is multiple generations of warfare with these people, and they were kind of scarred and fearful and bitter towards Carthage, and they were very terrified of Carthage ever resurfacing and repeating something as catastrophic as Hannibal's invasion of Italy itself. And so they basically made up an excuse that Carthage was trying to rebuild. They imagined them and presented them in the Senate as a threat, and was able to get the government of Rome to declare war, or the assemblies of Rome to declare war against the Carthaginians a third time, again, largely unprovoked, but just with the idea of finally taking care of Carthage once and for all, making sure it was never ever a threat to Roman sovereignty again. And so it basically culminates in a siege of the city itself. Carthage has no real army or anything in which to fight, but they are holed up within their city for a period of time. Rome eventually breaks in and burns the city to the ground, massacres numbers of Carthaginians, and enslaves the rest. It's also famously told, though perhaps anachronistic, that they even salted the ground of the Carthaginians in order to ensure that Carthage could never again be a fertile agricultural location for future empire. And so again, it was kind of a complete destruction of Carthage itself, and a pretty barbaric slaughter, even in the eyes of contemporary Romans. And again, not in justification, but in understanding, it just illuminates over again a century of conflict, the intense hatred and bitterness that had come to be between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And again, as I already said, the motivation for such a destruction would have been, revenge for for Hannibal and the first wars, fear that they could rise again, and just a desire to eliminate them from the scene so that Rome could be the one and only power, and there'd be no reminder of Carthage ever again. Again, up to that time, Carthage was one of the most beautiful, powerful trading cities in all the Mediterranean, and Rome eliminated it after the Third Punic War to become, as it says there, the supreme power around the Mediterranean, no longer having a rival. All right, so what are the consequences of the Punic Wars? Again, we're talking about wars. There's so many we could talk about. Why these? Well, because the Punic War was a real pivot point for the Roman Republic, because it went from being kind of a continental, local republic around the boot of Italy to, because of these now Mediterranean rivalries and border disputes, becoming an empire, having in its control the islands of the Mediterranean, having in its control Spain, having in its control parts of North Africa. And it just continued in that vein. They began to have expansion up into France, where they incorporated the people known as the Gauls. They began to expand eastward, and this is where they subsequently conquer the Greeks and the Macedonians and the remains of Alexander's empire there in the east. And they incorporate those. And then they even get a king, and I mentioned this in the last lecture, how they gain territory sometimes. They get a king in Pergamum, which is the region over in Asia Minor, or Turkey, or we also called it Ionia. And he, as he dies, he wills his kingdom to Rome, wanting his people, believing their security lies in joining and becoming part of the expanding Roman Empire. And so again, it's this conflict with the I was going to say Phoenicians, and that's correct, with Phoenicians / Carthaginians, that Rome just begins to expand and expand and expand, and goes from being, again, a kind of a small local republic to being a vast empire. And this is going to put certain strains upon their government and their people that they hadn't previously experienced. And that's why this is a key transitional moment for Rome. It expanded the territory and the peoples that it had to govern. It meant they needed a bigger military in order to maintain control and security along their expanded borders. I mean, again, they need a navy now in order to quickly transition and move throughout the Mediterranean Sea. This larger military meant that there was going to be an expanded power of generals, that they were now going to have not citizen soldiers who would serve in the military for just a short period of time, but you'd have professional soldiers who would spend most of their lives as soldiers. And that's an important distinction because they get their provision and they get their security for the rest of their lives from the function and purpose of the army. And again, the threat of a standing army to a free people is something that we'll talk about, because now you always have this military force that rulers can use to suppress even their own people. You also begin to get a loss of cultural identity, that there really was kind of a cultural, religious, moral identity that the Romans had that began to deteriorate as they began to incorporate people from North Africa and people from Spain and people from Greece and the Celts or the Gauls up in France. And so there was a deterioration of their values in terms of what does it mean to be Roman, what are the certain virtues and morality that a Roman citizen is supposed to have in order to participate and be part of that nation. You get a deterioration of the Roman family, birth rates within among Romans. Italian-born Romans begins to decline, where they're no longer now the majority, but the majority are outsiders who've been brought into the kingdom. You also get a lot of corruption with the new power and the war booty and the treasures of growing empire that gets channeled into the more powerful members of the Senate and the government. And so you get this expanding divide between the rich and the poor, which is always a dangerous, without that middle class, that content middle class driving the affairs of a government, the resentment and the abuses between a lot of rich and a lot of poor is never a good sign for the stability of a society. And so we'll pick that up much, but again, this is going to irrevocably change the shape of the Roman Republic and strain it to the point of eventual collapse. And so what? Again, the Punic Wars are an example of that same process described in the Roman army lecture of conquest and growth through defending their borders and trying to maintain security and doing it so well or so zealously that eventually they have more territory and more peoples to govern. And then that only leads them into further conflicts on those borders. And there's this ever widening cycle of expansion and incorporation of new peoples and new territories. And what we can say is really the beginning of imperial Rome. They still have a republic. They still have the same form of government they'd had since the overthrowing of Tarquin. But now they are an empire because they're not just governing Roman citizens, they're governing conquered peoples. And while they do make an attempt to incorporate those peoples into the empire, it's not a great process, and it brings a lot of instability. These dangers and instability center largely around the growing importance of slaves as a form of labor. I mentioned kind of the lowering birth rates of Roman citizens. That's counteracted not only by new people, being part of the empire, but also just the huge numbers of slaves and the percentage of people living within the Roman borders who are not citizens, who don't have a buy-in or don't have much of a future in the Roman Republic. To them, it's a dominating force that they might like to see destroyed or changed. Soldiers become a lot more powerful and permanent. Generals, if you can lead an army, all of a sudden, it doesn't matter if you have a legitimate position within the government itself, you wield influence. Same thing with wealth. Very powerful people made rich from the wars and expansion now all of a sudden have influence that, again, compared to the legitimate government, can't compete with or compare with. New paths to power. This is the idea that now people who gain to have, that's what I was just describing, who have power within the Roman Republic are no longer those who have served the civic good and have proven their experience or proven their legitimacy, but again, either through warfare, demagoguery, being able to appeal to the masses, being able to appeal to the poor and disenfranchised, or being very just wealthy and influential. Now, listen, they're the ones wielding power in the Republic, and they're not necessarily going to have the same regard for maintaining the checks and balances of the Republic that we've been studying. And then you just have the fact that it's a vast new territory and it's very difficult to manage, and that places strains logistically on the government. How do you govern such far distant and diverse territories as a democratic republic, or as a republic in which the people are supposed to wield the power, but the people really don't have the ability or the knowledge or even the efficiency in which to manage such vast resources. And so all these things we're going to be looking at how they are going to eventually lead to the collapse of the Roman Republic and the emergence of the Roman Empire. Um, so the Punic Wars, the biggest takeaway is they are this moment of transition in which these new complications and stresses are brought upon the Roman people. They win the wars, but they are oftentimes referred to as kind of a fatal pill that the Romans swallowed through victory, but then would eventually destroy the Republic itself. Alrighty, so we'll be looking at this and discussing it in class tomorrow. Appreciate your attention and effort. See you soon.